things. And that's a wonderful place because I get to see art, I get to see culture, I get to see psychology from all these different vantage points. And that's my goal, is for you to do this. Now, if I've done my job well, at the end of this, you'll go, that was really good, Rose, but not enough. And I want that because I want you to walk away from this going, wow, I'd like to learn a little more about some of the story of how art plays out in Israel. Now, when we were thinking about what would be a sort of good way to have a conversation like this, I right away thought about talking about women for two reasons. One, I think that it allows us to kind of focus in a way that sort of generally talking about it would take us all over the place. At least we're going to go down a particular path. It makes it sort of easy for us to think about and see things. And the second is to really right a wrong, and that is that women don't get their due in this world in general, and they certainly don't get it in the context of Israeli art. Particularly in the third portrait I'm going to show you, about an incredible woman who basically helped design the city of Tel Aviv. She's almost been erased from the history of the building of the city. When I was doing the research for this, these are things I've been teaching now for almost 20 years, but every time I do something important, and this is very important to me, I open up the research again to see where things are at. And I was upset to discover that in all the years, this woman who I think has done so much work for this country and for all of us, there's one mention of her in a doctoral dissertation. That's it. So these women deserve to be talked about. At least one of them, if you've been to Israel, and especially if you've been to Jerusalem, you may have heard of, and that is Anna Ticho. But I think that we can never say enough about her. So without further ado, I want to get started with the portrait. What I sort of planning in my head is to go through the portrait to give you the information, to tell you the story. I very much enjoy telling stories and using the art to help tell the story. At the end of the portrait, or at some point along the way, in a few of them, I've asked the rabbi to share some of his wisdom so that we can bring together our mutual interests and passions. And then I would love to hear from you, questions you have or insights you have about it. So let's get going. Anything before I get started, just so I...
Avi, in the middle of the screen, there's something that says, please move this window away from the shared application.
There we go. Okay. Yeah.
I think that's on your screen.
I'm sure it is. And let's see if I can get rid of it.
I tried moving it and it's not going anywhere. So I don't think it's my screen.
No, I think it's totally mine. How's that? No, it keeps coming back. So I don't know what the story is. I think it doesn't. Okay. Let's try and do it. I can't see you at the moment. Let's see if we can work it this way now.
Maybe you should reshare your screen. Get out and start again. See if that helps.
Let's see what we can do. Stop share.
Now you can see everybody.
Now I can see everybody. All the people that are there. Okay. Let's try this. All right. And now we'll make it much smaller.
All right, that's better.
How's that?
Looks good. Looks great.
Good. Okay. Now I have to say I love this particular piece that you're looking at here. I found it recently. It's probably from the 1940s or 50s. And what it's trying to tell you is that the first portrait I'm going to paint in using my words and showing you the art is actually about a group of women. And that is the whole story of how this whole notion of Zionism rewrote the whole text for what it meant to be a Jewish woman. I call this process Jewvolution. And my students always think I'm kind of being silly about it. And there is a tongue-in-cheek element to it, but it's kind of important to know that almost all of us, those of you who are currently living in North America, and certainly those of us who are living in Israel, if we think about where we were and have a look at the beautiful photo of the woman on the left, we have changed tremendously as Jews. We've all Jewvolved. I'm making up a word, so you got to help me work it out here. In other words, we've all changed to match ourselves to the surroundings that we have, to kind of come into the modern world. And what Zionism gave to the woman far, far earlier than it did in almost any other part of the world, was a sense of herself as powerful, as capable, as a kind of agent of change, having the ability to take control of her own destiny and the destiny of her people. And that really is a massive, massive revolution in the way in which women looked at themselves generally, and specifically how Jewish women looked at themselves. They were always sort of seen as the center of the Jewish family, the center of the home, but there was this sort of ring around them of people that were making other decisions. So they were kind of the middle of the story, and people were around them all over the place. And here, they get to choose the role. If they want to be in the middle of the family, they're in the middle of the family. If they want to be out in the field, like this particular woman who's hauling a milk can, probably some of you guys recognize these things. And when I teach my 18-year-olds, they have no concept of what the woman on the right is holding. And I have to remind them that that's how milk used to come. But let's have a look at how other ways in which the women kind of developed. This is a very early picture of these women. And we see here that they really are in the process of what I call Jewvolving. This is one of the early groups of women. They called themselves Chalutzot, the pioneers. They came to work in the land of Israel. And somebody tell me what the sort of odd thing they notice about this picture. Something isn't quite right about the location and the women themselves.
Well, the women are all wearing dresses, which we wouldn't wear to garden.
Right. None of us would do that, even if we went into the garden. And these women are working in, 100+ degrees in your degrees, right? It's boiling hot outside, and they're wearing long sleeves and full dresses, and some of them look like they're relatively white dresses.
Yes.
And what's the reason for it?
I was just going to say, they look completely posed.
They are posed, for sure.
I mean, not like they're really working there.
Yeah, no, and they were working. I've seen a few pictures of these particular women, but you're right that they stopped them, and they stopped them for the benefit of people like us, people that were looking at from the outside that could potentially help them. These were a part of a series of PR images. And thank you, I don't know who it was who said it, but thank you for raising this. You're gonna notice that there aren't a lot of artworks in the classical sense, but these are the artworks. The photography is a new medium. Zionism and photography come into the world, at least affordable photography, around the same time. And they were used in a very particular way. And that was to sell the image of this woman. The reason why I bring these up is because their actions in the world predate the world's ability to deal with it. In other words, there's no clothes for women farmers at this point. It's 1900. If women are working, and if they're working on farms, they're wearing these kind of clothes. Rabbi, you wanted to add something?
Avi, there's just a question from Barry that he put in the chat. He said, who's the man in the middle?
I don't know who the man is in the middle. I don't know if he's a guard. These women actually preferred, according to the historians, to do as much of their work on their own. They didn't want to be bothered by men, but there may have been a man that was given to them for some sort of security reason. Because remember that these are the days when there were a lot of kind of marauding groups of folks around. So I know much more about the group of women. This is a group, we'll talk about them again at the end, known as the Bilu Group, one of the early youth organizations that came to work in the land of Israel. And here they are, possibly as little as a decade later. And look how much they've changed. They're much more confident. They've either adapted men's clothing for themselves, or they've sewn clothing for themselves. They've really come into their own. And you can see what I mean when I talk about this whole process of Jewvolution. They're taking themselves quite seriously as these independent agents working the land. This is a great image from the Kvutzat Kinneret, one of the first kibbutzim, that is distinguished because it started its own women's agricultural college. It was the first people that came here around the time that Herzl was around, and even a little earlier. They knew nothing about agriculture. But the second generation of people made it their business to know how to grow things, and specifically they began to learn how to grow things in the land of Israel. And a woman named Rachel Blaustein, who became known much more for her poetry, she became known as the poet Rachel. But in fact, her early claim to fame was that she went to study in Paris, agricultural sciences, and came back and took a group of women and took them to Kvutzat Kinneret. And she created this very intense group of women. And there are two things about them that are interesting to note. One was their dedication to doing agriculture. And the second, in this story that I want to share with you, was their dedication to each other and to their socialist values. Now, this is an apocryphal story. I don't know if it's true. I've been hearing about it for a long time. You can see I kind of mishmash little bits and pieces. The story goes like this. The women lived on their own, but in the kvutza, there were also men. And once in a while, they would fall in love, although this was actually discouraged. It's a topic for another lecture on why it was that they discouraged people to get into couples and to get married. But it happened. Human nature kind of did that. And every once in a while, one of these women would get married. Now, they were socialists. They didn't believe in a big fancy wedding. They even shared a wedding dress. They had one dress that they all shared amongst each other. And when a young woman would get married, they would fit the dress. So if they had to let it out, they would let it out. If they had to let it in or shorten it, they would do that. Now, the apocryphal story is that a young lady is about to get married. Her other friends are busy fitting the dress to her. And she remembers that she hasn't gone to milk the cow. And that's her job. And the other women say to her, listen, honey, it's your wedding, right? Good, don't worry about it. We'll take care of it. And she says, no, I'm going to go out and do it. And there's no time in between doing that and going to get married. You see where this story is going? She puts on the wedding dress, puts on a pair of boots, and goes and milks the cow. And of course, in so doing, gets the dress ridiculously dirty. And instead of them freaking out about this and being upset that their one and only wedding dress was now permanently soiled, they loved it. It was like a badge of honor for them. And that's how seriously these women took their new role of not just sort of trying to be like men, but trying to be women in a whole new set of roles. And that's the portrait I want you to see. I want you to see that this was done on purpose. Whoever it was who very brilliantly talked about the staging of the photo, you should understand that all of this was created. The women were encouraged to follow this path. I'm not saying that they didn't choose it, but they did it in a very purposeful and kind of mindful way. They wanted to evolutionize themselves, to revolutionize themselves. Here they are, not just on the kibbutzim, but in Tel Aviv itself. These are women working in a quarry, and it's well known that a lot of the early buildings in Tel Aviv were built by young Jewish people, and among them were as many women as there were men. They also began to look differently and think differently about their bodies. So we see the development of what we know as Israeli folk dancing, or just folk dancing, which was an invented art. And it was often mixed. The photo I brought for you was to show you the women doing their own, but it was a big revolution that women, A, danced in front of men, and B, sometimes danced with men, right? Later on, the Rabbi will talk a little bit about Jewish law and separation of genders and things like that. But this was a big deal. The other piece I saw, because I love it, and it really rings true for any of us who are trying to do anything and raise children, is that these women took their bodies seriously. They were into physical fitness, but they also had children. And the photo is beautiful because it shows them kind of doing what almost every parent is doing today, multitasking, right? Trying to do your job. My Rabbi and I are busy trying to do our jobs and take care of our kids. But these women made it look easy. Look how fit they look and how happy. Now, part of it was that on the kibbutzim, children were put into these collective homes. They didn't stay at home with their moms or with their dads. They were either during the day or all day and all night, they were looked after by other people. But make no mistake, these women did what feminism showed us has been the pattern all the way along. They got into the work world that was once upon a time reserved only for men, but then they went home and did the other work that was traditionally done by women. There's no equality here. It's not like men rushed in to fill the void and started doing the cooking and the child rearing. Women were simply expected to do everything. And as usual, they did it, and they did it brilliantly. They also became soldiers. Early on in the story of Zionism, we see that women are taking up arms, they're riding horses, they're defending the settlements. There were as many women involved per capita as there were men in the War of Independence, and many of them were casualties in this particular war. And I wanted to show you these images. Now, a lot of that was rolled back after the War of Independence. Now, there are lots of political reasons for it. There was a move on the part of the ultra-Orthodox parties that were already, if you know something about Israeli politics, you know how much power they have relative to the number of people they have, but that was always true. And they really fought with the early founders of the state to not allow women to be in the army. But the women fought back. Now, they lost part of the battle. They weren't allowed to be equals in the army. That's almost done. We're still fighting that in Israel. There are now women finally who can be pilots, and there are women who are now tank commanders. Women are continually following the tradition of their mothers and grandmothers and now great-grandmothers of wanting to participate in every aspect of Israeli society. And it gets started particularly early.
Avi, can you say about the dates of those photos?
Most of these photos look to me, just by watching them, you see a little funny hat that's in the top left corner? That's known as a Palmach hat, which dates it to around the War of Independence, to around 1948. The woman looking very sort of like a sculpture in the bottom left is a famous photo. It appeared in Life magazine. Remember, the world is looking on at these Jews, not sort of understanding. It's 3 years after the Holocaust. And here's this group of very beautiful, very strong-looking human beings engaged in self-defense. And a famous photographer who made his name doing photography during D-Day comes to the land of Israel. His name was Zoltan Kruger. He ends up, I think, dying in either the Korean War or the Vietnam War. He was a really interesting character. He was just taken. He was enchanted by what he saw here. And he takes this famous photo and sells it to Life magazine. I know very little about the picture of the woman on the right. I love her. I think she's just amazing. She really sort of speaks to me. She's kind of tough and sweet all at the same time, which reminds me of lots of the women in my life and certainly lots of women in Israel. And here's someone I discovered getting ready for this talk. Her name is Golda Zahara Libitov. She has the distinction of being Israel's very first female pilot. But I want to tell you how important this is. There were like 3 airplanes in the War of Independence. So not only was she one of the first pilots, she was a women pilot, she was just one of the first pilots, which is awesome when you think about it. Now, sadly, she was killed during the war, not in a battle, in some kind of technical accident. We really didn't know what to do with these airplanes. There were very few people that were around, and we were facing an Egyptian Air Force that was quite large and strong, and they were given extra things by the British, who weren't particularly on our side in those days. I want to learn more about this woman. She looks like an absolute hero. I think I might have included a couple more images of her. I can't see the full screen. But she's one of these women, every once in a while when I poke around and look, I find a story and I go, wow, you know, this is a human being that I want to get to know. I want to know what makes a young woman in the 1940s decide, literally, I'm telling you, there were like 3 airplanes here. Why was that her career? And why was that her contribution? So I'm introducing you to a new friend of mine, and I want to get to know much more about her. I also want to say that, and it's really important to remember this, that as far as these women went, sexism beat back the progress all the time. And all of these are historical images. They range from, the piece on the right is from the 19-teens. The pieces on the left are from the 30s and probably the 50s. And they show us, as I said to you before, feminism, I always tell this to my students, we go to that kibbutz and we sit there and talk about these women, and I keep saying to them, feminism all over the world is thus far a one-way street, meaning that the women make the moves, the men don't respond, and the world hasn't put enough pressure yet. And my hope is that in the next generation, we can finish that work. Certainly you see it in various pockets, right? There are families like ours where there's 2 men and we're raising children and we're cooking and cleaning and doing all that. But that's still not the same thing, because it's still, you know, we have our family unit the way that it's built. I want to see family units where there's a man and a woman, and the statistics show that people are doing 50-50. But certainly in the history of Zionism, I can't sell you a Disney version of this. the women wanted it, they did it quite successfully, but it was never a complete mission, and there's still much more work to do. Now, to help create that, a whole new art form developed. Now, it's a whole new art form for us as a Jewish community. It had been gaining popularity all over Europe since the invention of inexpensive multicolor printing, and that is poster art, what's sometimes lovingly called graphic art. I happen to be a massive fan of it. I think it's beautiful. I love the way that it's done. And in those days, it was all done by hand. Today, it's all done by computer. But can you imagine, have a look at this beautiful piece that was done. And a big part of the creation of this portrait of this new woman, this new Jewish woman, was sold to people in the version of these graphic art pieces. So someone tell me why I chose this to be the first one, given the theory that I presented earlier. Someone take a guess why she's a really good first image to look at.
Well, the woman is dominant.
First of all, the woman is quite dominant. I think you're right. Laurel, right?
Yes.
Wonderful. But she's also fairly traditional in her look. Remember, we talked about this whole Jewvolution process. She still looks very much like a European farmer's wife. She's got the big dress and she's wearing the apron and her hair appears to be covered. That's going to disappear really very much by the next slide, I think. Yeah, gone. And here we have, again, as Laurel points out, the woman is very dominant here. She's big and strong. And here we begin to see the look of this particular human. And I want to say that this is a human thing. It's the Jew looking at themselves as capable. And one of the ways in which you see it, whether it's men or women, is you see the rolled up sleeves, the big muscles, the kind of big, broad grin, self-confident human being. I love the mashup here of the ultra-modern building that would have only really existed in the city and the kibbutz. They wanted to throw all of Zionism into one thing and give it to us as a kind of ideal. Yes, Laurel? Want me to go back?
Where are these women from? Were they born in Israel before it was Israel?
No, at this point they're not. They're all immigrants. They're largely immigrants from Poland and Russia, which meant that they came from Soviet or socialist backgrounds. Later, they would have children, and they were super proud of having children that were native born here, that ran around with no shoes and socks and had dark skin and never knew about what it meant to face anti-Semitism. They even used to call them little goyim because they said they're completely unafraid. They have no self-consciousness about being Jewish. They don't have any of the manners that they came with from Europe. And by the way, Israelis are still pretty proud of that. They love their Vilde Chaya children. I try and raise my kids with some semblance. I'm Canadian, right? And my husband's British. So our kids are like the only ones that say please and thank you. They really wanted to take what they were doing in these posters and kind of build it into their kids. And by the time we get to this poster, which is already late, it's already the late 1930s, this is from a film that talks about both the city experience, you can see the city in the background, and the kibbutz experience. Take a look at this woman. First of all, by traditional religious standards, she's exposing a lot of skin. But much more importantly, and I do this exercise, I can't do it for you here, but you can imagine, if you take and cover her face, in fact, if you cover the two faces of the two people there, you'd be hard pressed to figure out which one is male and which one is female. We're just being presented with strong, tough, brown bodies. And that shows us where they were going, what they wanted from these new Jewish people. It's different than how Jews were reinventing themselves in America, for example. And now again, you can invite me back for a whole other lecture where I compare this art to comic book art in America. And I want to talk, I love talking about the kind of different ways in which those two Jewish realities changed themselves. In North America, you'd be hard pressed to find someone who was interested in presenting a woman in 1939 as running around like that and being a farmer. That was not exactly a goal for North American Jews at that point, but it very much was in the period leading up to the birth of the State of Israel. And now I want to get to something else. And for this, I need a little help from the rabbi. I want to talk about how they folded in some of the Jewish into this. Now, they were very secular, but they all had gone to some version when they were back in Europe of some kind of religious Jewish education. They weren't interested in throwing it out the window completely. They wanted it to be a kind of flavoring, a part of who they were. They spoke Hebrew. They decided on Hebrew as opposed to Herzl, who envisioned this country speaking German. So they clearly wanted a Jewish root to what they were doing. And they often used Jewish quotes. And I've brought along a couple of pieces, but I want the rabbi to give us a little forward so that we understand what we're about to see.
We're about to look at a few different portraits that Avi has selected where the artists are really riffing on the words of Lecha Dodi. Right, so Lecha Dodi, of course, is the poem that we're many of us familiar with on Friday night that typifies the Kabbalat Shabbat service, but it's got a lot of deep layers to it, some of which have reasons why they're manifesting in the art the way it is. In general, to know about the history of the poem, right, Lecha Dodi was written by Shlomo Alkabetz, who was born around 1500 in the Ottoman Empire, and he really lived in the circle of the Ari, a Kabbalistic leader. And his grave is actually in Sfat, very close to the Ari, in fact. The first book that we have a record of the actual text of Lecha Dodi is in the 1580s, but the truth is that there were other poems that were published around the same time that had that phrase Lecha Dodi and different verses along the way with it. But this one, Lecha Dodi, is an acrostic of his name, so you know who the author is. The text, generally speaking, talks about a wedding. You hear this imagery of a bride coming together in the idea of Shabbat. But the truth is, even though the simplistic language seems to be talking about the feminine image of Shabbat or bride in this way, which is one of the reasons the artists are, of course, going to pick up on it, because all the image is feminine, of a feminine Shabbat who's coming in and being greeted. Probably what's happening mystically is that the piece is actually hinting at not Shabbat as bride, but actually two different aspects of the divine coming back together, the male and the female that are coming together. And you actually see that in the language. Because if you think about it, we say, Lecha Dodi likrat kala, come, my beloved, and greet the bride. So who is this, my beloved? The male, my beloved, probably the masculine aspect of the divine. And then you have likrat kala coming to the bride, to the feminine aspect of the divine. Because a core idea in Kabbalah generally is that there are different aspects of God, and that the Kabbalistic enterprise, the spiritual enterprise, is to unify those different elements into one in order to have a truly transcendent spiritual experience. And so the poem is picking up on that over and over again. It's picking up on a surface level talking about Shabbat, and a much deeper level talking about a feminine aspect of God, God's self, and bringing that together in a unified way to elevate us spiritually. And I think we'll see how that plays out in the art.
Absolutely. Excellent. So the Lecha Dodi turns out to be this wonderful gold mine for Zionist thinkers and for artists to sort of reimagine their world. And one of the most powerful pieces that I've seen is this one. Let's see if I can get back on track. For whatever reason, my remote control is giving me a hard time. Hold on. Oh, all right. Hold on. There we go. Okay. Now this is from World War II. What's happening in World War II in the land in those days that was known as British Mandate Palestine was that despite the fact that Jews were not being allowed into the land of Israel at a time when they most needed to, and the local Jewish community was seething in anger at the British for not allowing their relatives to be saved from the destruction of the Holocaust, they knew that they had to help the British. And they had to push their young people to get involved. And particularly they wanted to push the women who already had changed themselves and become very active human beings. And they wanted them to join the British Army. Now, there was a women's unit called the ATS. They were drivers and they were medics. They did some pretty important work in and around what was known as the Middle Eastern theater, because I don't know how much you know about the history of World War II, but World War II kind of comes knocking at the door here in the land of Israel because it goes as close to us as in Egypt. Now, what do they choose to get these women? They take a line from the Chadodi that says, Livji bigdei tifartech, put on your robes of glory. And I love this. I love the idea that the uniform, that a woman defending her homeland, defending her people, especially at this horrible time when she knew that there was nobody defending the Jewish people, that she would look at it not just as a physical thing that she was doing, not just as a military thing, but as a spiritual thing, as a Jewish thing, as something really super deep important that had its roots in this Jewish tradition of looking at women as being powerful entities. And the Lechadodi is really one of the first poems that talks about women as being like these human beings, these women that had agency. The woman is deciding, she's coming to meet her destiny. And this piece is definitely all about that. Now, I was so inspired by it that a number of years after I saw this, I did my own version of it. This is a painting that I did, I guess it's going on about 10 years from now, where I mashed up the traditional Lechadodi with much more modern poetry by a poet named Chaim Nachman Bialik, who was very taken by this image of the new Jewish woman and who talked about her in very powerful ways in the poetry that he did. And I wanted to kind of shift and play with that. But I love this idea that the robe of glory, and by the way, it was originally written, the reference to it in the original Lechadodi was about a woman who's in mourning for the destruction of the Jewish people. And it says, stop doing that. Stop being in mourning. Get up and dust yourself off and put on these beautiful robes. And here it is saying to these women, don't just wait for someone else to do this for you. Go and do it yourself. Come be part of this revolution.
And I think what you see picking up here from the Lechadodi piece there, if you can go back to that last art piece, Avi, is that the text there is very little about Shabbat actually, and almost entirely about Jerusalem, right? The first two verses and the last two verses reference Shabbat, but the overall picture is actually talking about Jerusalem and a sort of Zionist or pre-Zionist identity in terms of the sense of the land in mourning and looking for the land to rejoice. So I think when you look at that in the art, you really see that the piece itself, Lechadodi, is all about Israel, much more so than it actually is about Shabbat.
Right, and I want to say that in this particular, this is the last piece of this first portrait. Some of the women that you saw in that early photo appear in this one too. This was a group of women and men who worked together in some of the early kibbutzim, and they called themselves Bilu. Now, Bilu comes from the Chadodi. It's part of the letters of the Chadodi. It says, Bet Yisrael lechu v'nelcha. The house of Israel, get up and go. And they saw hidden in there a Zionist message that the Jewish people needed to get off their little tuchuses, sitting wherever they were in Europe. And remember, this was hardly a safe time. 1900 is the middle of the big pogrom period in Russia, where most of the Jewish community was living. And they had to come to a place that was even less safe. Take a look at the landscape around them. It took them a good 4 or 5 years, sometimes up to a decade, to clear away the rubble, to find sources of water, to be able to grow enough food to feed themselves. These were tough people. And they saw in the Lechadodi this hidden message that this was the right time and this was the way to do it. And that is our first portrait. Now, if I had been a traditional art historian, I would have talked to you about early artists in the land of Israel and the development of art, and I'm happy to do that. But I want you to get what we're trying to build here, about who these people are and how they see themselves. And if you want to understand Israel and Israelis, this is the story that I really think everybody should start with. Because now the descendants, the great-grandchildren of these people, the great-great-grandchildren in some cases, they very much see themselves in this particular light, in this very particular tradition. It's some of the things I love about Israelis and raising my children here, and some of the things I least like about it. It's very problematic. Anyone who's encountered Israelis knows that it's kind of a double-edged sword. There's something wonderful about that openness and that strength, and then there's something kind of annoying about it. But be that as it may, it is very much the Israeli ethos. So let's move on to portrait number 2. Rabbi, your
Let's just,
fingers are...
if you don't mind, let's just pause here for a second. Does anybody have any questions before we move on to portrait number
hold on,
2?
I forgot my own rules. I'm sorry.
We're kind of we got that beautiful introduction to the ideas of the construction of the new Jewish woman and what that looked like in Israel, and we're going to look at some very specific artists. But any questions on the history that Avi presented or the like? Not so much. Okay.
Okay, well, let's keep going.
Okay.
Now, in this middle section, and hopefully we'll get to all of it. I don't want to take up more of your time than you've graciously given to me. I want to introduce you to 2 women who I think are terrific. One is incredibly well known, and one is almost not known. The incredibly well known one is Anna Ticho. Now, are there people here who have heard of her, have seen her work? I'm trying to scroll through. Can someone tell me if we're...
Absolutely. Anna Tico's family lived in Glencoe, in Wilmette, or Winnetka, and they were friends of ours in our Chavurah at Mariah Congregation.
Oh,
They
wow.
Yes. And so we went to Israel. We visited Anna's home. And of course, they have her art all over their home in Winnetka. And they're dear people. And they're still around, the Ticos. Yeah. So I feel
Excellent.
personally connected and think about sitting in her garden up there in Jerusalem. It's very nice.
And I want to invite everybody to come and sit in her garden in Jerusalem. What's really lovely about the end of the story is that when Anna and her husband, Albert/Avraham, they never had children. Very likely because they were first cousins. But they never had children. And they decided to leave their home to us. They gave the home to the Israel Museum on the condition that the garden remain, which is beautiful, and that the place be free. And so people can come and see Anna Ticho's art and lots of other kinds of art. It's a really interesting mix now of contemporary and Anna's work. There's a gorgeous restaurant, which I hope survives all of this. It's a very special place that employs kids that are just coming off the streets. It's exceptional food. It's really a special place. It's one of the little Jerusalem sort of gems.
Right.
Someone is making comments. So, Rabbi, could you keep an eye on, just in case people are too shy to speak up but are writing on?
I'm keeping an eye on the comments.
Okay.
Joyce was telling us that Josh Tico, her great nephew, still lives in Glenview. So we have a deep Chicago connection here that you may not have been aware of.
I did not know this. Wow. This reminds me of the time when I was doing a whole talk on Eliezer ben Yehuda, who founded the modern Hebrew language, and was telling everybody what a nasty piece of work he was. And some kid raises her hand and says, yeah, that was my great-grandfather. And I said, oh, I'm sorry. She goes, no, that's what my parents told me too, that he was a nasty piece of work. So you never know. I happen to be a big fan of Anna Ticho's. I think she's done some incredible work. I want to tell you what I know about Anna Ticho and what I especially love about her. So the reason I'm gushing about the house is that that's really my introduction. My mom, who comes from a long line of lovely German Jewish ladies, they have always loved going to Anna Ticho's house and sitting in her lovely garden. It feels very much like what they envision the world should look like. And I think you can still see older women, even much older than my mom, who still get dressed up in their old Chanel suits and come out there to have a little bowl of soup. And, for them, this is kind of Europe meets the Middle East. And that was really Anna. She was this very refined lady who turned up here ostensibly because she was a Zionist and because she wanted to help her husband, who was the premier ophthalmologist of the period. So before you see a picture of Dr. Ticho, I don't think that's Anna behind him, but that was one of her day jobs, was being a nurse. You see the house and the area that's been decked off in the garden, and you have a sign that still sits in the house. It's the original sign of Dr. Ticho's beautiful, beautiful ophthalmological hospital. People came from all over the Middle East, all over the world to get treated by him. And Anna she would sort of divide her days eventually into spending time in the morning working with her husband, with Dr. Ticho, going out and doing her art in the afternoon. And in the evening, the house was turned into kind of a cultural center. There was a grand piano, and they had lavish meals, and everybody from Martin Buber to all of the famous people that came to visit in Israel, they would come and hang out at their house. It was sort of party central for people. They were very, very generous. They were next door neighbors to the original Zionist rabbi, a guy named Rav Kook. And as a result, even though they themselves didn't keep kosher or keep Shabbat, the museum, part of the contract is that it has to be closed on Shabbat and it has to only serve kosher food. They were very respectful of that particular relationship. Now, Anna had been trained already by the time she came to Palestine as an artist, but when she got here, she found the light impossible to work in. If you compare the European light to what goes on here in Israel, it's two different things. And a lot of these European artists would turn up and they were blinded by the light. And the contrast between the light and the dark was really hard. And the rumor was that it took Anna the better part of a decade to kind of get her visual bearing. There's a lot of metaphors here. Dr. Ticho was an eye doctor, and she had all kinds of issues with her eyes. At the end of her life, she becomes blind and continues to paint. It's a very beautiful, sort of sad metaphor. But one of the things that Anna did that no women were doing this, was that she would go running around Jerusalem. And I want you to think of Jerusalem, if you've been here, you know, it's a big city. In fact, it's Israel's largest city. It's not the case. The people were barely living outside the walls of the old city. What we think of as the downtown core of Jerusalem, and that's where the Ticho house is located, was considered to be kind of almost like no man's land. And so just a little bit further out, there were a few local Arab villages, and there were different neighborhoods that people were living in. And Anna would go out with her tools of the trade. She would go with sketching and watercolors. And it was not considered safe for a woman to run around in those days. And again, one of these apocryphal stories was that among the local Palestinians, the local Arabs in this area, people started to look at Anna, and they decided hands off. And she was clearly wealthy. Nobody robbed her, nobody assaulted her, nobody bothered her, because they assumed that she was mentally ill. And in their tradition, people who are mentally ill have some kind of special gift, and it's hands off. They didn't understand from artists. They saw this woman roaming around in the heat of the day, drawing, and they assumed that there was some kind of spirit that was inside of her. And so therefore, for most of her working life, even when it wasn't safe for women to run around, Dr. Ticho himself was nearly murdered in one of the riots in the 1920s. But never was Anna once hurt in all the years that she did her work. And she became famous for doing these gorgeous, detailed pencil drawings of the rocks and the sort of flora and fauna of the area. But because she was given such immense access to all things Jerusalem, she also fell in love with the people. And it's really rare that an artist is as good at capturing people as they are at landscape. Usually artists kind of divide themselves. Their passion is either with the non-human or with the human. And Anna seems to have had a double passion. So along with these gorgeous pieces, we get these beautiful portraits of human beings. And Anna seems to have been able to see them in ways that people would frequently not see them. Either because they were poor, Jerusalem is still known as a big beggar city, or because they were ethnically from somewhere else. This person is a Yemenite, and most Europeans didn't pay attention to them. But not Anna. She saw them in all their beauty and spent time with them and listened to their stories and asked their permission to have them pose for her. And they're just beautiful, sensitive things, these pieces of work. Now, I told you that Anna, later in her life, her eyesight started to go. She didn't stop painting. And this is a piece that's got to be later. You can see the major change in technique as her eyesight is changing. She's kind of becoming looser and more flowy in the work that she's doing. This is an older piece, but look at how she just captures something so gorgeous about this human being and giving this woman so much dignity. And my guess is that this was a woman who was a beggar. Now in 1960, Dr. Tycho dies. He had never really recovered from being assaulted the way that he was, and he slept on for several decades. And Anna was left alone with no children in this big house. And as I told you, her eyesight started to go. And she decided to stop going out. And all kinds of young people and lots of artists, you know, people had kind of adopted her. They created family around her. And they said, Mrs. Tycho, would you like to go out? And she said, no, I've seen enough in my life. I'm just going to paint from my memory. And for close to 20 years, she continued to do her work. And these are some of her later pieces. And I think they're so beautiful. They're so different than the early stuff. They have a different feel to them altogether. But they have a different kind of a beauty. And it's a beauty that's coming from her mind's eye. It's not anymore seeing what she can see physically. It's remembering and it's feeling. And it's obviously physically more difficult for her to do the work. But clearly her imagination is still as strong as it was in 1980 when she finally passed away as it was in 1960 when she stopped going out. This is another late piece of hers. And it's a pretty rare business. You know, we tend to like to look at artists at their best, when they were young, when they were healthy, when they were in their prime. And here we have an example of a person who had two primes, maybe three. Right? There was the younger self, which we didn't talk about. There was that middle period where she was all things to all people. And then at the end of her life, she's kind of living in some sort of different, almost a visionary state. And that's why, to my mind, she's such an interesting person. So that is portrait number 2. Any questions or comments?
I love seeing the work. Thank you for showing it.
I never get tired of this work. It's interesting. When Benjamin, my husband, and I had our 10th anniversary, I splurged and bought him a little tiny print, which we keep in our living room. And it's really one of our most prized possessions. We love this piece.
Okay.
And I encourage you to learn more about Anna Tycho, and please come to Israel when you're allowed to do that, and come and sit in her garden, and come have some yummy food, and come see art. It's a wonderful treat. So now I have a little next treat for you. Now I want to introduce you to somebody that almost nobody talks about. Her name is Jenya Averbuch, and she is what I call one of the designing women.
Avi, just one second. There was a question in the chat earlier that I just wanted to draw your attention to. Barry where was it? Barry, you had asked about the earlier pieces. Just to jump back for a second, Barry had asked about the posters of the 1930s obviously show the Israeli lifestyle of the time, but the style of the art is quite similar to American and German Art Deco. Is that correct?
There is something in that. Anna would have learned during the Art Nouveau period, so just a little before Art Deco. We're going to get seriously into Deco in a second. She was European trained. Now you should know that there was already an art school here, meaning that there was an attempt to create, and again, if you want to do it again, I'm happy to do it with you. There was an attempt to create a kind of local art. Anna is not considered to be part of that. She's considered to be kind of a European transplant who begins to use the European gaze, the way of doing art that's very European. And Barry is definitely correct that there's a kind of European feel to it, but looking at the local Jerusalem area. And that's what makes her so interesting. So yes, she's considered to be part of the Israeli art history, but not in the way that some of the other artists would be. Because she is very much, I think, looking a little bit like an outsider in. And it's going to take a few generations of artists to be able to look from in the middle of the whole business. And you can very much see that Anna is an observer. Most artists are, but there's something that is a little bit distant. And so I think it is Barry, right, who made the point, helps us understand that she very much was this woman who came here and tried to find her place in some kind of way, and her art reflects that. Now, the next woman that I want to deal with is the opposite. Okay, this woman Jenya is very much of Tel Aviv. Now, she wasn't born in Tel Aviv. She is the daughter of one of the founding families of Tel Aviv. Her father was the first licensed pharmacist in Tel Aviv, and he's remembered for that contribution. They came over when she was a really little kid, like maybe 2 or 3 years old, and she grows up in what's known as Little Tel Aviv. Tel Aviv was an interesting experiment, again, subject for its own conversation, the development of this amazing city. And if you've been to Tel Aviv, especially if you've been to Tel Aviv in the last decade, you know that it's become a real world-class city. But its intention was never that. It was actually meant to be a little bit like in your part of the world, one of these beautiful garden suburb areas. And it was meant to be family friendly. And what happened was that in 1909, a group of middle-class families that didn't want to go to kibbutzim, they didn't want to go the socialist route. They were, regular capitalist people. They wanted to start businesses and create a sort of a European style city. They kind of based it on what they had seen in places like Odessa. That was sort of the model for it. They hired an architect who was Scottish, who knew nothing about the Middle East. He ended up making a terrible mistake. He pointed the city in the wrong direction. So it becomes the only city on the Mediterranean not to be built using the breeze that comes off the Mediterranean, but blocking it. So that was kind of a dumb thing that he did. But these families wanted to create a kind of nice family atmosphere for themselves. And it worked for a while. What changed it was all those young people I mentioned before, right? They brought in young Jewish kids, basically people in their late teens, early 20s, to build the city. And they fell in love with it. And they stayed. And they brought their youth culture with them. And they brought some of their crazy ways. And they brought all of this developing Israeliness with them. And so Tel Aviv doesn't really stay a kind of family-friendly suburb for very long. And it very quickly becomes the cultural hub of the whole Zionist enterprise. It also becomes the business hub of the whole Zionist enterprise. And Jenya is raised in this. And there's no place for people to study architecture. What Jenya is seeing is architecture that has been brought over from Europe and is kind of a mishmash. Take a look at this building, which still exists. In fact, this is a drawing from an architectural firm that found the building in ruins on a major street on Rothschild Boulevard and gave it this beautiful facelift to really bring it back to its full glory. And what you see here is lovingly called the eclectic style. Eclectic is a sort of code word for confused. It doesn't have a style. It has some Middle East, it has some Gothic, it has lots of European, it has some fantasy stuff. It looks like something out of, Alibaba and the 40 Thieves half the time, but it has Roman columns in it. It's painted in this weird European color. It really has no identity of its own. And the generation of people that was raised here, some of them born here and then some of them that had grown up here from childhood, they weren't so happy with it. It didn't feel modern, it didn't feel authentic, it didn't feel like something that belonged to them. And they created an artistic and cultural revolution, which we see in the buildings, and that's known as the Bauhaus. Now, strictly speaking, the Bauhaus is a school in Germany that created everything from buildings to furniture to textiles, you name it. They designed everything. But it had at its core a philosophy that melded very nicely with Zionism, and particularly with capitalist Zionism. It wanted simplicity. Right? I'm going to go back for a second to show you the difference in the elements of design. It believed that its sort of mantra was form follows function. No unnecessary decoration. Pure, simple, clean lines. It really respected geometry. It had this beautiful play. I love this particular building because it's a play between the line and the curve. And they thought that's all you need to make something beautiful. They wanted it to be white, to reflect this gorgeous light. They weren't trying to fight with it and create of it something that wasn't local. They saw in this something that was going to be very much of the experience of this new Jewish land that they were building. Jenny Averbuch goes to Rome and later studies in other places in Europe, and she comes home with this bug known as the Bauhaus, as sometimes called the international style. She wants to transform Tel Aviv. Now, again, without getting too much into it, Tel Aviv has suffered for many, many decades, almost a full century, of never looking backwards. So a lot of the old buildings got destroyed to build these buildings, and then these buildings got destroyed to build new buildings, which was a mistake. And only in the last, I would say, decade and a half, have Tel Avivians begun to really see the beauty of these buildings and preserving them. A lot of them are in terrible shape. They weren't so cleverly built all the time. They put stucco on them, which is great for the desert, but not really good for the seaside. Genia was one of the first people to anticipate road traffic and cars, but a lot of her colleagues didn't, and a lot of these white buildings don't stay white for very long with that amount of smog coming at them. And also, after a few decades, they didn't look interesting to people anymore. They didn't keep up with the modern. But Genia saw through all of that, and that was the genius of this particular woman. This is her home. This is a building that she built. Now you'll notice, and this is really one of the hallmarks of this international style, of what we sometimes call the Tel Aviv Bauhaus, was that there's an equality between the floors. My guess is the piece at the top is a later addition. But what they wanted there was to say that people who were going to live in Tel Aviv, and you probably know this because I know Chicago is like one of the homes of skyscrapers. The higher up you are, the fancier you're considered to be, and the more expensive you're considered to be. So often in the older construction, the fancy ones were the penthouse ones, and they had higher ceilings, or bigger windows, or bigger porches. And here there's something very equal about it. So even though Tel Aviv is a capitalist city, it's not a kibbutz where they were sharing wedding dresses. They wanted there to be a level of equality and simplicity, and also affordability. They wanted people to be able to build and own their own piece of this dream. To show off all of this, the local people, what would eventually be the government of Israel, but what was then the local Zionist council, began to have a fair, very much in the way of the world's fairs or trade fairs, that they called the Levant Fair, that was held in Tel Aviv. In 1934, Genia and her partners, she had come back from Europe, and in a very rare move had started her own business. Think about it, it's 1925, 1930, a woman running her own business. So she took a male partner to make sure that nobody would complain, but she also had a female partner. There were only really 2 or 3 women architects that were very rare in the world at all, and certainly rare in that scene. And they were invited to design the restaurant for this. And what they came up with was this beautiful building on the beach called Cafe Galena. And it was a revolution. It had big, wide open spaces. It had this beautiful, I told you, curves and lines. It played here with the beautiful curves. It almost looks like a wave that's hitting the shore. And I dare say it's something very feminine. And it was an immediate hit. In fact, it was such a big hit that all the other buildings you see around you were taken down. They were all meant to be temporary. But Cafe Galena stayed for many, many years. It became, I think at some point, a casino, but it was a very popular building. And there's nothing better, there's no greater statement to an architect than somebody loving and using their building. It was clear that Genia had something that the other architects didn't have. And in particular, she had some kind of magic that I think came from her experience of being a woman. These are the Dizengoffs, Meir and his wife, Tziona. Meir was the first mayor. It's interesting that his name was Meir. He was sort of a big character. He rode around on a horse and used to pinch tushies of the local girls. He was a character. But he had a deep, deep loving relationship with his wife, Tziona, who was a big patron of the arts. In fact, after she died relatively young. The home that they had built on Rothschild Boulevard was given to the city as one of the country's first dedicated art museums. And Dizengoff wanted to build, in memory of Tziona, a beautiful public space. And he sends out an invitation to all of the architects and architectural firms. And Jenya starts to think, if you want to honor a woman and you want to create a space that says Tel Aviv is a place that cares about the people that live in it, what's that going to look like? And she sits down, and this is one of the versions of the sketches that Jenya proposed. And she said, first of all, let's not make it a square. Let's make it a circle. Nothing has that sort of motherly, feminine feel than a circular building. Now, these Bauhaus buildings have a kind of tough quality to them. They're kind of masculine, right? They kind of jut out. They got tough, strong things. Jenny wanted to create something that had softness to it. And she said, look, I'm not going to design all the buildings. We can have other people design the buildings, but they all have to work around the circle. The circle is where people are going to hang out, where families are going to let kids play, where couples are going to go and hang out, where people are going to go and read a book. And Dizengoff himself fell in love with the idea. And it was not a simple business to do, engineering-wise, to be able to create buildings that were fronted with this beautiful circular pattern. The other idea that Jenya had was that the center of it needed to be dug underground so that there would be access for cars, because she accurately predicted that there would be cars. And people laughed at her and said that she was a silly woman and she had no idea what she was talking about. About 30 years later, when there was so much traffic that you couldn't just block up the middle of Tel Aviv, they basically ruined her design by lifting up the center of this square to make roads. And they're now in the process of undoing it. And what they're doing is they're going back to Jenya's original design. They're digging underground and creating parking spaces. This is what we get. This is what an aerial view looks like. And you can see how the buildings conform beautifully to the idea that there needs to be this central circuit, this circle, and it has to be people-friendly. What gets created on the ground is this gorgeous, gorgeous architecture. And you see how each one of the buildings starts to roll around the center. Now, this is what the original design looked like. It doesn't look like this right now, and it hasn't for many decades, for the simple reason that this became a major intersection in Tel Aviv, and they had to make room for the cars. But look how beautiful it is, and I have some gorgeous pictures. I never tire of looking at it. Look how the buildings sort of undulate like waves on the sand, and that was really very much the idea, that this was going to be a very Tel Aviv, even though it's the middle of Tel Aviv, it's going to feel like a little bit like the beach. Okay, and this is just beautiful. And you can almost feel the wave in this particular building. Now, once she had achieved that level of notoriety, the project started to flow in. And she got a lot of commissions, a little bit like your buddy Frank Lloyd Wright. And a lot of people wanted to have buildings built for homes. But like Frank Lloyd Wright, Jenny was really concerned about the public welfare. And she took a project on that is still a model in this country of how to create residences for workers, in this case, workers who were involved in the Habima Theater. And she created this beautiful space for them in the middle of downtown Tel Aviv, where the buildings face in on each other and there's a shared courtyard. I happen to live in one of those spaces here in Jerusalem. It was built much later in the 1950s, but Jenya's original concept was taken. All of our buildings front on this little, it's like a little piece of paradise, this little tiny inside garden that allows people a little space to be with each other. And you can imagine in these horrible times when people we've been cooped up in our homes now since some of us the beginning of March, that yard has come in real handy for people. Jenya designed this building in the later part of her career that was eventually the home of one of the presidents of Israel and is now the Ben-Tzvi Institute. And at the very end of her career, she was asked by an Orthodox institution to create a house of study, a Beit Midrash, which she did in 1965. Jenya is partly responsible for Tel Aviv, known as the White City, being declared by the United Nations in the year 2003 to be a World Heritage Site. Her concept and the buildings that were built by her and her colleagues turned out to be one of these precious spaces in the world. There's almost nothing left of the Bauhaus in Europe because it was all destroyed during World War II. And you Americans have beautiful Bauhaus buildings, a little bit in New York, and I'm sure lots in Chicago, but the majority of them, of course, are in Florida. Those ones are not considered to be pure Bauhaus, they're Art Deco. They're a little more decorative, they're a little more colorful. These are considered to be the most classic examples of this very rare phenomenon known as the Tel Aviv Bauhaus. We have Jenya to thank for that. And now I ask you, isn't it ridiculous that people don't know her story?
Yeah.
Isn't it incredible that a woman designs this beautiful center of a gorgeous city and she's erased from the history?
Well, thank you, Avi, for sharing someone with us that none of us knew about before.
Now, friends, we get, oh, it looks to me like there's questions. Is there anything we want to do before we want to hit our last?
Well, Jason says institutional sexism. That would be correct, Jason.
100%.
Who gets credit for
I didn't hear.
who gets credit for her stuff if her name isn't used?
So she had a male partner, and often his name is used, or the name of the firm is used, or they're kind of lumped together, and it's just known as the White City or the Tel Aviv Bauhaus, which is a really clever way of erasing it. Right? Now, in so doing, a lot of the architects generally are erased, but I've heard lots of names of male architects, and lots has been written. Architecture is a big business here in Israel, and there's a lot of good architects. Right? This is a country that's been building itself for 70-something years. So people are studying architecture. The fact that one woman 3 years ago wrote, and it's not even a dissertation on Jenya, she's one of several women that she wrote about. No movie has been made about her. No book has been written solely about her. I learned about her probably 10, 15 years ago, but that's because I'm always on the lookout for these stories. And to my mind, she was always an interesting story. And the connection between wanting to create that beautiful feminine space for Dizengoff to remember his beloved wife, it always sort of stayed in my heart. And I'm gratified that she's getting her day. You know, and I would love to learn much more about her.
I understand that Cynthia had a question. Cynthia, are you still on?
I think you're right. I think she popped off.
Oh, okay. All right. Any other questions?
We have time. We'll...
Any other questions right now before we look at the next section?
Okay. So now, folks, we're, as they say in The Wizard of Oz, we're going to look at a horse of a different color. I didn't want to just leave you with stuff from the past. I wanted to give you a little bit of insight into how art and how particularly women artists have developed in the later part of the 20th and certainly the early part of the 21st century. I wanted to look very sort of specifically in one area that I thought was important for us to think about. And that is how contemporary women artists in this country are looking at their Jewishness and their femaleness. Meaning that what we're going to be looking at is feminist Jewish art that comes from the Israeli experience. Now, I'm going to say something and then I'm going to ask the rabbi to say something. First and foremost, I want you to know that there's a great suspicion on the part of the general art community here of art that deals with Jewish stuff. Long, long time ago, there was a kind of hands-off policy on Jewish. Jewish art was seen as something that belonged somewhere else. Let European and American Jews do that kind of work. Let religious people paint pictures like that. When you come to Jerusalem, there's lots of Jewish artists out there, but they're often dismissed by the art establishment in this country. So not only is this work brave because it's feminist and it dares to critique Jewish ideas and tradition, but it's brave because it dares to critique Israeli art for not taking its Jewish roots very seriously and not moving Judaism in any kind of meaningful way forward. So the artists that we're going to look at in these last remaining moments are really incredible double pioneers, because they're mixing it up here in a lot of different ways. So much so that in the same way that the Impressionists, those of you who know something about art history, you know that the Impressionists became the Impressionists largely because they had to set up their own shop. They were kind of frozen out of the art establishment. Jewish artists in Israel have been frozen out. And they are emerging. They have their own biennial art show. Every 2 years there's an art show. There's some small spaces in museums that are dedicated to Jewish art, but it is an emerging field. And what's interesting is that the women are at the forefront of this. And now I'm going to turn it over to my wonderful friend and momentary colleague.
Thank you. I'm just going to say a word, and then I'm going to let the art speak for itself, because I want to be, respectful of our time and get to these beautiful pieces. But just as a word of introduction here, Avi is going to be showing us, and Jason, you say, is all Israeli art Jewish art? I think what Avi, good question, Jason. I think what Avi is saying is, you, and Avi, correct me if I'm wrong, you could say that Israeli Jewish art, right, as in it's Jewish art because it's made by a Jewish artist, right? What we're looking at here is art that specifically takes up Jewish subjects and Jewish subject matter and Jewish text and Jewish ritual, and weaving that into art, which is a little bit distinct. And one can imagine quite complex for the female artist, because what we'll see here is a lot of the artists referencing the patriarchal system from which we come, where women had and have less rights, less responsibilities, and are often oppressed in one manner or another. And those ideas, which might feel very foreign to us as part of the American conservative movement, are very present for an Israeli in a very different way, where religion is embedded in a different way, and the power structures of religion look different in Israel than they do here. So for example, we'll see artists who are referencing the idea of kol isha, that a woman's voice shouldn't be heard in public because it would be thought to be too sexual, too enticing to men around her. That's a real live issue in parts of Israeli society about whether women can sing in public and what that means in state ceremonies and the like. And we're going to see the artists reacting to that idea in the same way that the idea of agunot, of women who are trapped into marriages where they might be civilly divorced, but their husband refuses to grant a religious divorce, and therefore they're chained or trapped into those marriages, are ideas that we've resolved, as it were, in the conservative movement by writing different ketubah text and thinking about a halachic process very differently. However, they're very live issues for Israelis, where religious courts are, where the law, religious law, is controlled by the rabbanut, by the rabbinate, who makes the decisions about what ultimately happens in terms of religious law, and there isn't a pluralism there. So we'll see all of that playing out in what the artists here are reacting to and making a statement about. And I think we'll let the art speak.
Right. So I want to piggyback on what the rabbi was saying in answer to Jason's question. So first of all, the Israeli art establishment would take umbrage with the idea that it would necessarily need to be Jewish. First and foremost, because not all artists here are of Jewish faith. There are Christians and Muslims that are also producing art. But also the art establishment sees itself as incredibly secular. And their answer to what they consider to be the bullying on the part of orthodoxy of official state religion is to stay very far away from it, to kind of declare it to be not an area that they're interested in at all. So if they happen to be Jewish, they'll say that, right? They don't deny their Jewishness, but it's not an interest or preoccupation of theirs. And in fact, they look down upon it. And that's really too bad, because I think that if they were to take it a little more seriously, some incredible work would come through. Now, of the 4 artists I'm going to show you some pieces of, 2 of them are immigrants. They're American-born women who came to live in Israel. And that's quite significant because they come with both of their much more integrated Jewish and secular piece. And it's something that I often say to North American Jews, is that in many ways, your Jewish and your secular are more woven in together, precisely because religion and state are so much more separated. In Israel, people don't want to make that distinction. They just want to put it aside. They don't want to deal with it. But these two women have come here and they're saying some really important things. The other two women are very much from here.
Avi, there's a question also from Michelle. Michelle asks, were Sephardi women culturally more restricted from creating art than Ashkenazi women? Or do you think the society just recognized Ashkenazi art more?
So for sure, and again, you're opening up wonderful questions and wonderful issues for its own examination. And I want to build on that question. It's not just about Sephardic women, it's about ultra-Orthodox or Haredi women. The Bezalel Art School, the oldest art school in the country, recently began giving classes in ultra-Orthodox neighborhoods. So Mizrahi women have traditionally been completely left out of the story and are beginning to climb into it. There are a small but important number of women who are coming into this picture who are talking about themselves and their Middle Eastern Mizrahi identity. And this is really new. I mean, we're talking maybe the last 4 or 5 years. There are ultra-Orthodox women who are for the first time being told that it's okay for them to express themselves visually, that they're allowed to make art and being taught to do art and being honored to do art. I'm going to show you one of those women who predates all of this by probably 2 decades, who has been ostracized by her community, and she pulls no punches. So I started with this piece by Andy Aronowitz, who's a really interesting woman, an American woman who comes to live here probably 20, 30 years ago, starts to look at the place in different ways, and I think the piece kind of speaks for itself. But historically, we have to pay respect to Michal Naaman. Michal Naaman creates the first piece of feminist Jewish art in this country. Michal Naaman comes to Jerusalem to live here in the 1970s because that is where the Bezalel Art School is. She knows that the ultra-Orthodox neighborhoods are areas that she shouldn't go into, but she goes into them. And when she goes into it, she sees this massive poster, you can still see it today, that talks about what the daughters of Israel should do. And basically it declares all the things that women need to do to be clothed properly. And so how they're allowed to walk around in these neighborhoods. Now she's a woman who's used to living in a secular democratic society. And suddenly she's being told that in order to walk the streets of the capital of her country, she has to restrict herself and the way that she dresses. And she decides to do an art protest. She goes to Mea Shearim, takes a piece of paper, writes down word for word what she sees on the sign, with her bare arms and her bare legs, which would be enough to get you stoned in that neighborhood. Wets the ends of the paper to look like the Torah. Can you see how it looks like the Torah? And sits down and protests in the streets of the ultra-Orthodox neighborhood. Someone takes a photograph of it and it becomes this landmark piece of work. Because what else does it look like?
She's bound. She's bound.
I think, Joy, you said she's bound, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, she's shackled.
Yes, she's shackled.
She's making a statement that this version of the Torah that she rejects, that she does not consider to be authentic, is binding her and is not allowing her to be the human being that she wants to be. And Michal Naaman becomes one of these interesting women that kind of makes this statement and then runs away and never really does another piece of Jewish-oriented art. She does great art. Her art is represented in galleries all over the world. There may even be a Michal Naaman in your own very own prestigious art institute, but it's not this. It's completely secular in its nature or political. She does this statement and she goes, I'm done with that. I don't want to deal with it. It's up to this woman, Nechama Golan, almost 20 years later, coming from within the ultra-Orthodox community, to really hammer home the message that being a woman and being ultra-Orthodox is an impossible state for her. She continues to cover her head, and she continues to see herself as an Orthodox human being. But here she takes the image of one of the books of the Talmud, specifically a book where men are telling women how to behave. And what is she telling us about it?
Does everybody see the words there that say Sefer Nashim, a book about women, right? Meaning
Yeah.
the part of the Talmud that's talking about how women are meant to regulate their bodies. It's the text that she's planting in this photograph.
Right. And what's happening to her in this photograph?
She's literally speaking until she's blue in the face. I don't know if that's translates in Israel, if that's a saying.
It doesn't, but I love that. Jason, thank you very much. I'm going to use that. Do you mind? I'm going to steal it from you.
It almost
She's
looked
talking until she's blue in the face. But why else would a person turn blue?
Well, and Michelle was saying in the chat that she looks like she's suffocated.
Exactly. Exactly. I love your insight, Jason. I really want to use it. I think it's great. But in fact, what she's saying is that this is suffocating. This is not giving me air to breathe. There are versions of this where she's not blue, but I think this one is really the most important and the most
I think
intense.
she's also covering her ears.
Yeah,
Just want to hear this.
right,
Horrible.
right. It's strong stuff.
It is horrible. That's what I noticed too, Joy, the way that she's plugging up her ears. Like, don't let any more of it in.
Right.
And she's screaming, but of course it's covered over, so nobody is really allowed to hear her. So she is screaming until she's blue in the face, but no one's ever going to hear her. And then she creates this out of old copies of the Talmud. And she takes this shoe and references this old Jewish tradition that it's a relatively obscure Jewish law that if a woman gets married and her husband dies before she has children, then she's obligated to marry his next nearest relative, male relative, until she produces a child. And if she refuses to, there's a ceremony, or if he refuses to marry her, there's a ceremony where she takes a shoe and throws it at her. But I think that Nechama is doing something else here. This is a feminist statement. She's kind of blending her Jewish feminism with her general feminism. What is it that women hate about these shoes? Why is it that feminists call those rape machines?
Yeah.
Because you can't run away in them, right? They slow you down. They also do terrible things to your body. And I don't know about how many of people who are listening to us today know this story, but I believe that it took my mom something like 4 or 5 years to be able to walk in flat shoes after a lifetime of walking in high heels. It did terrible, terrible damage to her body. And so not only is Nechama making a statement here about how Jewish law restricts her, she's making a statement about the patriarchy in general and how it restricts her. I think it's a very strong piece. By the way, it was used for a book. I never got to see the book. I only saw the cover, called Jews and Shoes. If you ever find it somewhere on Amazon, let me know if it's a good book. But the person who wrote the book chose this piece of art as the cover.
I love the art. It's terrific.
I love the art.
Yeah.
So here are your two American-born. One is a woman I only have started to learn about. I love her work. Her name is Ruth Schreiber. She's riffing, she's kind of playing with that notion before that we learned about in the Lecha Dodi, that God has masculine and feminine aspects, and she's making it literal. And I love this. What's especially interesting is that when you study the history of Michelangelo, who painted the original, he never used women as models. He only worked with men. If you look at Michelangelo's women, they all look like, dudes with a female head. Never mind that everybody looks like they were at the gym all day. And he had his own particular reasons for that. We won't get into that. But the fact is that women are completely erased from his story. And Ruth is just saying, no, I'm putting it all back in there. I'm giving God back a feminine face. I'm rewriting art history. I'm undoing the patriarchy in one beautiful piece of work. And here she even makes a more intense feminist statement in this piece called the Shabbat Table. And can you see that the candles in the candlesticks are lipstick? And do I need to tell you what the challahs look like? And she's saying that if those are the two main mitzvot that a woman does in the Orthodox world is lighting the candles and making the challah, then she's going to really own them. And she's going to own them big as female objects. I think it's fabulous. The rabbi mentioned before the agunot, this horrible story of women who never signed a marriage contract, because according to Orthodox law, a woman doesn't sign her marriage contract. She just receives it in her hand, and she's not allowed to annul it, even if the husband runs away on her and takes up with somebody else. Unless the husband initiates the divorce, she's what's known as an aguna, which literally means an anchor. She is anchored to the marriage. And what Andy has done in this brilliant piece is she's taken pieces of ketubot from women who are actually agunot. They were stuck in these marriages and created this heavy, heavy coat to represent this weight of what Jewish law is doing to these women. It was featured in the first of its kind, a Jewish feminist art show that was held in 2012 at a very important art museum on a kibbutz, where there's one lone Orthodox woman who's a curator. She's an incredible human being. Her name is Devorah Liss. She's done some work with Spertus College in your part of the world, because they do some really, I think, incredible Jewish art. And she brought, this was her dream to do a feminist Jewish art program, and the Jewish world didn't want her, and the secular world didn't want her. And she pushed and pushed and pushed, and finally she got the chance to do it. And this was one of the pieces that she included. I want to finish with this piece because I think it speaks so much to the Israeli experience, the Jewish experience, to the maternal experience. Just 2 days ago in Israel, we commemorated the day where we remember all of these fallen soldiers. And this was about the hardest year yet, because the families weren't allowed to go see their fallen relatives in the cemeteries. It was a real point of controversy. To protect most of these people, most of whom are now elderly, they were not allowed to go to the cemetery. And I saw this piece by Andy, and I said, you know what, I want to finish here. Because although it's a bit graphic, and lots of jokes get made about Jewish mothers and their sons, and how they never cut the umbilical cord, that's not what Andy's doing. It's not that one-dimensional. It's not a little joke that Andy is saying, haha, look at these Jewish moms, they can't let go of their children. It's that in the reality that is Israel, lots of mothers sacrifice their children. Lots of moms have to let go of their sons. And that bond never ends in life or in death. And any mom, regardless of where she's at, if she has a child in the army, she lives in a constant state of panic. I know some women that for the entire time that their child is in service, they won't leave the country. They won't put the phone down. They don't even sleep for a night because they know what's on the line for them. And so Andy is giving us a very different message. And I didn't want to just end on a critical message. I wanted to end on what I think is the most important thing. And that is for you to have a sense of what it means to live in the reality of what is Israel. It's an honor to share this with you and a privilege. And I'm grateful to the rabbi for having asked me. I hope I've done my job by not giving you nearly enough, because it's just literally scratching a little bit at the surface. We're over our time, so I thank you for indulging me in the extra few minutes, and would be happy to take any last questions or comments that you have.
I know there was a question, Jason had asked, where was the kibbutz that had such a great gallery?
Unfortunately, I've lost the
You
sound on
mentioned
your...
the kibbutz with the gallery, Avi.
Which gallery
Oh,
was
can you hear me now?
Okay, good. I'm just having trouble hearing.
What kibbutz? What kibbutz?
It's Kibbutz Ein Harod. Kibbutz Ein Harod has the distinction of having the country's first dedicated art museum. It uses only natural light. It's quite an amazing place. It's a gem of Israeli culture. And the story goes that when the people came to the kibbutz, they dumped all of their Judaica, all their Jewish stuff, Torahs and Kiddush cups and stuff. They dumped it in the warehouse. And the museum was given the job of literally in the back room to kind of show these secular people what Jews used to do when they lived back in Europe. So they had old dusty collections of Chanukiot and shofars, and along comes this woman, Devorah Liz, and she says, we can do really cool stuff here. There's so many wonderful pieces of art. These things tell stories, and we should know about it. And then she started to invite contemporary artists to mix in with the old stuff. And she has, I think, single-handedly done so much, not just for Jewish art in Israel, but for Israeli art. And I recommend the next time you come to Israel, it's a massive schlep, but it is one of the most important art spaces in the country.
Oh, thank you. Any other questions?
Just want to thank you for choosing such interesting topics and people pointing these things out to us, even though I know some of it. It was just a pleasure to hear you speak about it. It's
It was a pleasure for me to share it with you.
Thank you.
I want to say that I want to keep this going. I want people to get interested in Israeli art and Israeli culture. And, there's a lot of talk right now about how there's a kind of divorce happening between our two Jewish worlds. There are two major Jewish worlds. You live in one and I live in one. And we have so many bridges to build and so much common space to talk about. And this is my particular way of trying to kind of build one of those bridges. I'm not saying that it's an easy experience, and I don't think that everybody here agrees with what Israel does, but we have this root. We both changed ourselves in the 20th century in incredible ways. We've both built massive amounts of wonderful culture. It's time for us to kind of come together and have that conversation. And so I'm really honored to be able to do that with you. And I thank you again. I especially want to thank Rabbi Dror for inviting me to do this.
Well, I think we are all so privileged to have learned from you, Avi, today, and to experience art, and indeed for you to build that bridge for us in a way that here in our own homes, we are as if in an Israeli gallery. And we're so grateful and lucky to have learned from you today.
Thank you.
I'm giving you one of these elbows.
Thank you, everybody.
It was
Thank you
great.
so much. Bye-bye.
Take care, everybody.
Dror, I don't know why your sound is so funky.
My computer is deciding to cut out, so I'm gonna honor that the computer is dying and say goodbye.
Bye. Okay. You can stop your sharing. There you go. Okay. Thank you, Avi. I'm gonna end the meeting. Have a good day, everybody.
Thank you.